This is Michael Leroy, also known as the Lord of Deadside, or Shadow Man. Now, Shadow Man was kind of a sleeper hit for the Dreamcast, N64, PC, and PS1 back in 1999. It was generally well received by critics and has gone on to have quite the cult following these days. There are still Facebook groups full of people that talk about this game nearly daily. I should know, I am part of one of them. I am an absolutely huge fan of this franchise. I like to collect for it, as you see here, and I'm actually such a big fan of the franchise that there was one point where I was kind of bouncing from couch to couch here and there, trying to pay off some old apartments and get my stuff together. I actually hacked a PSP, installed this game, and played it that way. Terrible frame rate and all. And I enjoyed every second of it. Disclaimer, I do own this game, I do not condone piracy, and I installed it to my PSP by creating an eboot file off of this disc. The reason that I bring that up is just to say that some of the things I say in this video might seem like they are criticisms of this game or whatever, but that's not the case. I am simply just making a comparison between this game and the sequel, and that's what we are going to talk about today. Shadow Man's Second Coming was released in North America on February 28, 2002. It was released as, and still is, a PlayStation 2 exclusive. From what I gather from some of those Facebook Shadow Man groups I spoke about earlier, the assets to this game have long since been lost. And I would actually trust that more than just an average rumor, considering there are many members of the original development team in these groups. Now, I've done a little bit of research and digging for this video, and I have actually spoken to people on Facebook and read forum posts. This game is actually not that well received by the Shadow Man community. It's not negatively received per se, but most people just find it to be kind of average. It's kind of just there and worth a playthrough. And when you ask people who feel this way what their reasoning is, they actually have some legitimate criticisms, and we're going to talk about that today. This is episode 2 of the series I'm doing called In Defense Of. What I do with this series is take a look back at any particular franchise or artist and re-examine the lesser-loved movies, albums, or video games from said franchise. We look at the flaws, and then we work our way backwards to find anything that a particular piece of art or entertainment does right, or at least does well enough. Disclaimer before we get going, I am actually playing this on a jailbroken PS3, but as you can see, I do own a copy of the game. As I said before, I don't condone piracy, but if you do have a PlayStation 3, I cannot more strongly suggest installing this game. A lot of the issues with the original hardware do still occur. You're still going to have frame rate issues, and you're still going to have semi-long loading times here and there still will be textures that don't load. But overall, I will say that it is a much better experience to be playing this off of the PlayStation 3 hard drive. I suggest using Mr. Mario's tutorial if this is something that you are interested in doing. I do find it to be completely worth it. Even though this is a relatively obscure game that is almost 20 years old, I'm still going to issue a spoiler alert. Chapter 1, The Criticisms. Now, I didn't have the most lofty expectations considering that we are playing a PlayStation 2 game 18 years after it was released, but damn are some of these graphics ugly. Some of these almost look like they could have been pulled off on the Sega Dreamcast, and it's even more disappointing when you realize this game came out after Metal Gear Solid 2. The quality of the character models varies as well, with obviously Shadow Man being the one that looks the best. Probably had the most attention paid because this is the one you're going to see the most as you're playing through the game and looking at promotional material. In fairness, the ugly graphics are pretty much relegated to the cutscenes and a couple character models. Overall, this game does look pretty good, but it's kinda hard to overlook that opening cutscene. That looks hideous. Speaking of graphics and assets and whatnot, I am very disappointed to announce that even if you are emulating this game, you're still gonna have this widespread issue where the levels don't properly load in Ireland and you're left with like this polka-dotted pattern on almost everything. That's kind of disappointing in and of itself, but it's even more disappointing when you realize that Ireland is one of the best designed levels in either of the Shadow Man games, and the puzzles and structures of everything in this level are incredibly well made. But it's kind of luck of the draw on whether the level will actually load properly or not. Now, before you say this is because you're emulating the game, no. I've played it on the fat PS2, I've played it on the slim PS2, and I asked in the group if anyone else had come up with this issue, and everyone seems to have gone through this at one point or another. It's complete luck of the draw if the textures will actually properly load. And when they do, it's amazing. But you're probably going to be stuck with this. Another complaint, and I am not one to complain about foul language at all. I don't think there is such a thing as foul language, and if you're going to get upset over the words another person chooses to use, there's something wrong with you. But I also think it's kind of corny when bad language is used just as a means to appear edgy. I don't know. I wasn't offended by it at all. I just thought the delivery was a little bit cheesy. Speaking of cheese, the way that Shadow Man talks to the enemies in this game, he's full of confidence, but at the same time, his insults just do not land. They are so bad.
Says who? Skinny?
Like, I think most people have probably come up with better burns than that when they were in elementary school. One of the other complaints that I have about this game is Mama Nettie's new design and voice actress. What the hell is this? I want Miss Cleo back. Nettie's not the only holdover from the first game that doesn't get her due diligence though. Jaunty, fan favorite character in the first game. Some of the most hilarious dialogue that I've ever heard in a game from this time is relegated to one decently lengthed cutscene and a couple sentences later on. Very disappointing and a huge missed opportunity for humor. Many would argue that this game doesn't have the same captivating atmosphere or the same amount of unique levels as the first game. I would agree and disagree with both of these, and we will get into that now. We are going to defend Shadow Man's Second Coming. Chapter 2, The Details. The plot is very basic and very similar to the one in the first game. Essentially, you have to stop bad dudes from killing everyone on Earth. You play as Michael Leroy just as you did in the first game. Your two closest friends sort of make a return, and you're going to use your powers as Shadow Man to use voodoo and switch between Deadside and Lifeside, although the vast majority of this game occurs within Lifeside. After an incredibly short stint in Deadside, you start at the Wild at Heart, which is actually a bar owned by Mike that you see in the opening sequence of the first game. I thought this was a nice touch, and I really enjoyed getting to explore the upstairs and the apartment area, even if it was really short. It was a great little bit of fan service. The gameplay has many new things to add to the equation, however. For starters, there is no asylum. There are no 5 serial killers. There is no Legion, no Blood Sisters, no prison or sewers. But in their place, you will find a few very large areas to explore as you collect sigils and hunt down the game's 5 bosses. You'll find yourself completing many puzzles and challenges that are clearly made with a similar design philosophy to the first game. Time challenges, switch puzzles, platforming, obstacles that require certain weapons. There's a lot of fun and challenge to be had here. You progress through this game by collecting sigils, similar to Dark Souls in the sense that you gain access to new areas as you collect more and more. Through a certain lens, you could consider these games to border on being collectathons. One major difference between these games is that you can choose between using Mike or Shadow Man to complete certain tasks. Yes, they're the same person technically, but they have different abilities. Mike is the human form. That's who he is during daytime hours. And Shadow Man is the walker between worlds who Mike turns into during nighttime hours. It was obvious that this would be an important game mechanic as the box art and trailers all made you very aware of the two personalities. There are voodoo weapons that cannot be used by Mike. He can also drown and die from fall damage, but he can move heavy blocks that can't be moved by Shadow Man, who is immune to environmental hazards and is able to use voodoo powers. The light from the mask in Shadow Man's chest also helps to brighten dark areas, which would have been really handy in the Asylum Undercity. At first, the character changes are strictly based on time passing from a predetermined game clock that the player cannot manipulate, but later on you find a pocket watch that allows you to control time and switch between the characters as you see fit. This is very important because in the first game, Mike, the human form, is pretty much totally useless and essentially only exists until the player finds 3 parts of a magic blade that cause permanent nightfall in Lifeside. But in this game, you'll actually need to strategize which form of Shadow Man or Mike you need to use. It is actually important from a gameplay perspective and adds another layer to the familiar gameplay for returning players. It's very cool that the animation and transition sequence is non-intrusive and it can happen anytime, whether you are aiming or swimming or doing anything else. Also, Mike has been hitting the gym. This is weird and does not resemble Mike from the first Shadow Man game, but it actually does serve a purpose. You can tell from his appearance right off the bat that he will be stronger than Shadow Man, which makes the block puzzles make more sense. Thankfully though, despite the major differences in appearance for both Mike and Shadow Man, Red Pepper, the voice actor from the first game, returns to provide the voice, and I couldn't imagine it any other way.
I am the Lord of Deadside, so move over, Skinny, cause this lord's coming through.
Side note, Jaunty also has the same actor.
I'll tell you anything you want. The president's a moron. The Queen of England's got genital warts. My mother was a donkey-loving strumpet.
Now the controls are both better and worse. It's hard to explain controls verbally, but Shadow Man is really slippery. His controls are much improved during combat, moving on ground, and swimming, but precision platforming is a pain in the ass because of these slippery and sometimes unresponsive controls. There were countless times that I know for a fact I pushed the jump button just for Shadow Man to keep walking forward and just fall off of a ledge. There also seems to be inconsistency with the strength of his jumps, but always in the sense that he jumps way further than intended. This is not terribly common, but there were a few times that he jumped completely over platforms when I barely pushed the up button. Overall, I think they did a great job, considering this game controls on 2 analog sticks, one for turning and one for forward and backward movement. It's important to remember that dual stick movement was becoming standard at the time and was somewhat new when this game was released. When you consider this, the issues are pretty much easier to cope with. The combat is much improved over the first game. You can actually fight barehanded now. There are actually finishing moves, but I accidentally wasn't recording when I was performing these, so I don't have footage. It's actually really cool though. Once the enemy is stunned, you run up behind them, hit whatever button's on screen, and you can rip their spine out. Aside from being one of the first games with dual lock-on and strafing, the original Shadow Man had very tedious combat, even if you were dual-wielding powerful weapons. In this game, you have up to 4 assignable weapon slots depending on the size of the weapons you choose to equip. The lock-on is automatic, and this is mostly cool with a few really annoying exceptions. There are a few weapons that return, but we are gifted mostly a new arsenal of firearms, voodoo weapons, Nephilim weapons, and spells. Overall, the weapon selection in this game is absolutely far superior to the first game, and is impressive even compared to other action games of the time. Most of these weapons have multiple uses and are great for completing levels with differing strategies. The weapons and the way that the rifle scope appears also changes depending on whether you are Mike or Shadow Man, which is actually a really cool detail. Inventory management is also handled much better this time around. All of your weapons and items are separated by kind throughout the menu accessed by the select button. This makes everything much more organized and makes more sense than having a selection with no discernible order or structure. You can also examine each item with the circle button to learn what each weapon or item is intended for. Better inventory management is just one of the lessons learned by the developers. It was very easy to get lost in the first game. I would argue that was part of the charm and made the exploration and eventual discovery much more rewarding, but was also a major pain in the ass to not know exactly where to go or what to do. In other words, the game had some very cryptic design, and you would rarely ever receive any helpful hints from Jaunty or Nettie. Even now, having completed the first game more than a dozen times over the years, I still sometimes get a little lost from time to time looking for certain items or coffin gates. This is largely remedied here by the camera showing you what happens when you push a switch, Mike telling you to watch your step or to look for something else in the area. Sometimes he downright tells you what you're supposed to be doing.
I need to use the bear and get out of here. I've got some shit to deal with.
Sometimes this is annoying, but I'll welcome anything that was intended to be an improvement. Now, the exploration in this game is every bit as fun and as rewarding as ever. There are fewer overall levels, true, but they make up for that tenfold by adding so many hidden paths and making the switch puzzle so engaging and huge that you won't likely notice. Some of these levels aren't too much bigger than some of the levels in Shadow Man, and some of them are huge and intertwined. They make up for this by adding multiple warp points inside of each and every level on top of the same kinds of fast travel mechanisms you unlocked in both games. These levels are large enough and didn't leave me feeling like anything ended too abruptly. Now, in this franchise, most of the challenge comes from the level design and exploration elements. The enemies and bosses were nothing much in terms of challenge in 1999, but in this game, they are a total joke. The next to last boss fight, directly before the final boss, was over in a matter of seconds. Just watch.
Yeah.
Also, what happened to flame immunity? How can Shadow Man die in a fire pit if he was immune to flames and heat and was able to swim in lava in the first game? Back to the point, this game is really easy. Most of your deaths are just a minor annoyance as you can warp back to nearly anywhere, even during a boss fight. Now I am completely split on this. On the one hand, I'm glad they eliminated hours of unnecessary backtracking, but on the other hand, it removes most of the tension from the boss encounters. But overall, I'll take it since, as I mentioned before, you'll probably miss a lot of the jumps in the platforming sections. The Boneyard benefits tremendously from the added fast travel, as this is the section with the most difficult platforming. Also, if Jack the Ripper ever killed you in the first game, you'll know how great this travel mechanic would have been. As I said, I'll welcome anything that was intended to be an improvement. There are plenty of health pickups and tons of ammo, and there's even a voodoo item that replenishes your health with that of surrounding enemies. The voodoo items are the coolest thing about your inventory in my opinion. They're amazing and it's fun to experiment with all of the different ways you can eliminate hordes of enemies, and they're generally never a requirement for progression. In fact, you could play through the majority of this game with just a nail gun if you wanted to. The choice of playstyle is amazing. You can arm yourself with just the shadow gun, or you can use a shotgun and the famine pickup. The choice is yours, and I'm looking forward to replaying the game just to see what all these combinations have to offer. Just don't get too close to the Kali explosion, because much like the Calabash in the first game, it will kill you. Funnily enough, certain enemies survive, but you get the point. The level design will feel familiar to fans of the original. There are very few reused areas in the game, and the ones that make an appearance here are generally much different than their last generation counterparts. For example, the church. Before we talk about the church, I just want to mention, what the hell kind of pathway is this? No wonder no one is ever in there. The place is accessible only to gymnasts. Back to it, you'll soon discover that the room off to the right actually leads to a decently expansive area behind the church. And even later than that, you discover that the altar of the Loa is actually contained in a huge underground area underneath the church. Some of the brand new levels are going to feel a little bit familiar as well. For example, the pit in Gehenna is similar in function to the Cathedral of Pain. It's essentially a hub world to the game's bosses. The other Lifeside levels are much different than anything found in the original. Sections of Louisiana are somewhat similar in some ways, but it's largely new. Russia is a frozen winter wonderland and Ireland is, well, whatever it's supposed to be. I don't even remember what it looks like when it's properly loaded, but I remember it giving me kind of an old school vibe. You know, there were castles and whatnot. Ireland would be the standout of the Lifeside levels because, as I mentioned before, this is one of the most well-made levels of either game, easily. But it's pretty much impossible to enjoy with these glitches. So with that, I'll go with the electric panel maze in Louisiana as being my favorite segment of Lifeside. However, regardless of how great these levels are, none of them hold a candle to the Boneyard Isle of the Dead section of the game. This is technically the last level, and the developers most definitely saved the best for last. This part of the game is visually the most reminiscent of the first game while also being the best showcase of your new abilities. This level is perfectly paced, and after completing each section, I was surprised right around the corner with something even larger. I loved the revisit to Deadside, replaying the very first section of the game with new abilities and new areas to discover. It was great to run by Jaunty and pass through the Marrow Gates again, even if... Hold on a minute. If Shadow Man is the Lord of Deadside, why can't he open the gates Never mind. I love the Well of Blood, and having to raise and reposition bridges and platforms. I loved the Duppy Village and the multiple pathways up and down the mountains and the platforms you had to raise by releasing them from the ground. Not to mention there were no sigils in this location, it was just all about exploring and enjoying the view. You collect one of the best weapons in the game in this area as well. I had the most fun in this section and the one after it. The Isle of the Dead. Holy shit, if you don't think this is one of the best sections in this franchise, I don't know what to tell you. The level is massive and expansive. You must use multiple voodoo objects to progress, and you'll be doing some of the most rewarding exploration in the entire game here. Some of the sigils are more open, and some of them require a very keen eye, and I loved the use of windows to show you sigils and rooms that you hadn't found yet. There are multiple sections in this level that are accessed differently. Some of them you can find after exploring the Boneyard, and other ones you can only access by entering this section through the portal that you find in the pit. If you find you're having a hard time collecting all of the sigils, make sure you've explored fully. This level is not straightforward and is not easy. You'll have to really come with your A game, which shouldn't be too difficult after you've mastered everything else in this game and probably the one before it. So, to recap, I loved this game. There's so much to love here with a great level design, meaningful and rewarding exploration, excellent combat and choice of weaponry, fun and engaging puzzles, great environments, good pacing, and the return of Red Pepper as the voice of Shadow Man. I also love that you can switch between Mike and Shadow Man, and there's actually a real reason to do so. The evolution and controls were a welcome addition, and I think this game is just very well made overall. Now, as far as atmosphere in comparison to the first, I'm gonna have to side with the detractors, but only slightly. Maybe it is nostalgia, but I find the first game to be much more terrifying and memorable overall. I enjoyed the overall presentation here, but I don't remember anything from the soundtrack. And that's very unfortunate, considering that's widely regarded as one of the greatest elements of the first game. The soundtrack here is very good, and it fits the atmosphere, and I really did enjoy a couple of the tracks, but there's no comparison in that department. The first game had a better use of horrifying music and atmosphere, so I'll have to give that point to the original. But what we were given in the sequel, considering there were some behind the scenes issues during development, I think we should be happy, and I think it's a very good game. Sure, it's not on the same level as the first overall, but it does some things very well, and I would be lying if I told you I didn't enjoy almost every second of this game and do desire to replay it in the near future. This will sound a little hypocritical considering the content of this review, but if you're going to play this game, I suggest looking at it as its own thing. When you're playing it, don't be actively comparing it to the first game. Take it all in and enjoy what they give you, and I think you'll find it to be an enjoyable ride, even if you do find that it has its faults. Remind yourself that every game does. Yes, even the beloved first game, which is my favorite game of all time. So is it better than Shadow Man? Hell no, not by a mile. Is it bad? No. It does have some major unforgivable issues, mostly with the Ireland level not loading properly. I'll repeat myself when I say that this happened on multiple versions of the PS2 console with 2 different copies of the disc, and also happened during PC emulation. This is a major problem in any game, but especially a game of this scope, as you can't remember where you have been as easily as you would like to, and the majority of that level is based on exploring. This game is everything it needed to be. It's an imperfect sequel to an imperfect game, a sequel that chose to mostly try new things and build upon familiar elements without completely rehashing anything, and it gave us many new things that were sorely needed in a game of this size and caliber. If I gave it a letter grade, it would be a B, or I'd give it a 7.5 out of 10. I think this game is totally worth a playthrough, and it is a very inexpensive game to pick up either online or in stores. Be warned, it is on the original blue DVD, and many older PS2 systems have issues with these games. Hence my recommendation to jailbreak a PS3 and play it that way. Either way, I think you should play it, and I don't think you will be disappointed. Also, in case you were unaware, I am very happy to tell you that Night Dive Studios is currently working on a remaster of the first Shadow Man, and it will be out next year. Not sure about you, but I haven't been this excited for a game in years, possibly ever. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Have a good day.